let's discuss one of the most important topics in all of poker strategy. And that is, how do you decide when you should fold, call, or raise when someone bets? First things first, you need to always consider the minimum defense frequency. Now, you're not always going to strictly adhere to the minimum defense frequency, but the main takeaway from it is very important. The minimum defense frequency is 1 minus the bet you are facing divided by the bet plus the pot. And essentially, as you are facing a smaller bet, you should defend more often because you're getting way better pot odds. And as you are facing larger bets, you should defend tighter. Let's take a look at the calculator real quick. Let's say we are facing a pot size bet. Well, in that scenario, the bet would be one pot size, divided by the bet plus the pot, which would be our opponent's 1 bet plus the pot size, which is 1. So we'd have 1 divided by 1 plus 1, which is 2, which is 0.5. So we have 1 minus 0.5. 1 minus 0.5 is 0.5. You clearly know that. 1 minus 0.5 equals 0.5. This means that we need to defend with roughly 50% of our range. Now, when you're in position, you're often going to defend a little bit more. When you're out of position, you're often going to defend a little bit less. But if you're folding in this scenario, something like 80% of the time when your opponent bets, you're probably folding way, way, way too often. What if instead the opponent bet 20% pot? Well, now you'd have 0.2 divided by a pot size plus 0.2. 1.2 equals minus, whoops, lost it. Minus 1 equals 83%. So now we need to defend with 83% of our range, roughly. Again, a little bit more in position, a little bit less out of position. But in that scenario, if you're folding half the time, as a lot of people do, you're going to get crushed. All right. So as you're facing bigger bets, you should defend less often. And as you're facing smaller bets, you should defend more often. However, you're going to find that you should often defend tighter when you are not going to realize your equity well, which is usually going to be when you are out of position. So if someone raises from early position and you call the big blind, you check the flop and they bet, you're going to be folding way more than minimum defense frequency because you're out of position against a strong range. That's not really where you want to be. Also, every hand in your defending range that you call a bet with needs to actually be able to realize its required equity based on the pot odds. It's important to note, minimum defense frequency and pot odds are different. If we go back to the pot size bet example, remember you needed to defend with 50% of your range, right? Roughly. But your pot odds are 33%. Every hand in your range needs to realize 33% equity, which would be your bet divided by the entire pot after you call, which would be your opponent's pot size bet, your pot size call, and the previous pot, right? So every hand in your range in that scenario needs to realize 33% equity or more. Okay? Realize it's been a little bit math heavy so far, but we'll shy away from the math. All right. A common flop scenario that you're going to face is when there's a bet and then it folds around to you, or if you're heads up, someone bets and it's on you. We need a way to generalize these situations because they come up all the time. We need to develop a framework so that we can implement a strong, robust strategy. And you're going to find that when you're facing a bet, there are 4 main factors that will determine how you should continue. And those are your hand type, who has the nut advantage, the stack depth, and also your position. So let's discuss each of these before we get into specifics. So factor number 1 is your hand type. If you have junk, what is junk? Junk is a hand like 1 overcard and no backdoor draw whatsoever. Or a really, really, really bad pocket pair on a board like Jack 10-9, like pocket 2s on Jack 10-9 is junk. These hands are just going to fold. Simple as that. You don't need to be running insane bluffs with total garbage. Just get out of the way. Next, if you have a marginal made hand, you're usually going to call. Marginal made hands are going to be hands like middle pair, bottom pair, top pair bad kicker, sometimes ace high, sometimes king high, depending on the board. And then, if you have a premium hand or a draw, you're usually going to call or raise, depending on the other factors. A premium hand is usually a hand that you're happy getting a lot of money in with, like a set or 2 pair or a straight or an overpair. And a draw can vary in strength from being like a really, really good draw, like a straight flush draw or overcards with a flush draw, all the way down to a really junky draw, like a bad gut shot, or even 2 overcards with a backdoor flush draw. Next, the nut advantage is very important. This is essentially who has more nut hands in their range. For example, if someone raises under the gun and you call in the big blind and it comes jack 6-6, well, under the gun has almost no sixes, but the big blind does. So big blind, even though they're going to be way behind the under the gun's range in general, they're going to have more super high equity hands, which leads to a lot of raising. Whenever you have the nut advantage, you usually respond with a lot of raising. And when you do not have the nut advantage, such as on ace, king, jack, when under the gun raises and you call in the big blind, in that scenario, you do mostly calling. So as your nut advantage increases, you raise more often, and as it decreases, you call more often. Whenever you do decide to raise, by the way, whenever you're in position, this is when someone raises and you call from, let's say, the button. If you're going to raise, you usually want to raise to a somewhat small size, like 2.5 times your opponent's bet, maybe a little bit more. But when you're out of position, you're usually going to want to go a little bit bigger. Usually going to want to go something like 3 times the opponent's bet or more, because if you are check raising with your draws and your best made hands, with your draws, you don't care if you build a big pot, and with your best made hands, you don't care if you build a big pot, and with your draws, you don't care if your opponents fold. Also, there's a big key adjustment factor in this spot, and that is your opponent's range connectivity. Essentially, you want to raise larger when your opponent is likely to have obviously strong hands in their range. For example, you're going to want to check raise huge on a board like King Jack 4, about 70% size the pot or perhaps more, because if someone raises and you call from, let's say, the big blind, and it comes King Jack 4 and you decide you want to check raise with a hand like bottom set or maybe a gut shot straight draw, you're going to want to go very big because your opponent's likely to have something that's pretty decent, right? Which means they're not going to fold. And whenever you do have a set, well, you want to make sure you're playing a big pot. And you're going to usually want to raise small when your opponent is unlikely to have, obviously, strong hands. Again, if they raise under the gun and you call the big blind and it comes 7-5-4, that's a spot to check raise, usually using a smaller size because they have almost no straights in their range. And if they don't raise pocket 4s or 5s pre-flop, they just fold them or they limp them, then they have almost no sets either. So in that spot, they don't have very many strong hands, and in that case, you don't really care what pot odds you give them because they're usually going to have nothing. Next, stack depth is very important. As you get deeper stacked, you're going to find that you get to call bets with implied odds hands wider. So you're going to find that hands like backdoor flush draws become decently valuable as you get deeper and deeper stacked, because if you do happen to improve to a backdoor flush, you're very likely to get paid off for a huge amount of chips. Also, when you do decide that you're going to raise, playing deeper stacked, you usually want to raise larger, because when you do raise, you're raising with your best hands and your draws. And that is a very polarized range. And with the best hands in your range, like your sets and straights and 2 pairs and whatnot, you want to get all of your money in by the river, and you do that by raising larger initially. If you compare this to when you are shallower stacked, you're going to find that you should call these implied odds hands a little bit less often, because if you do happen to get lucky and make a backdoor flush, you're not going to win all that much money because you don't have all that much money in front of you. And when you do raise, you're usually also going to raise smaller because you don't need to raise big to build a pot, because you can only win so much money because you're playing shallow stacked. Okay? Let's take a look at position. This influences how you go about constructing your ranges. A very important point is that you want to be more inclined to raise when you are out of position due to having a difficult time playing the weak draws on the turn when they fail to improve. You don't really want to call with a bad gut shot straight draw out of position and then just have to check fold it a lot on the turn. That's not what you want. So you're going to find that whenever you check from out of position, someone bets, you should do a decent amount of check raising, which is the exact opposite of what a lot of people do. They just call a lot with their bad draws out of position and then check fold them later, and that results in them getting completely run over. And if your opponents win all the small pots from you, it's not going to work out for you. That said, when you're in position, you can be way more inclined to call. with a larger chunk of your range because quite often on the turn, your opponent's going to check and then you can bet and pick up the pot. Or if they do call you on the turn, you have another chance to bluff them on the river. So you want to make sure that you are check raising far more often when you are out of position compared to raising when you are in position. And you'll find that if you look at GTO solutions, quite often the out of position players check raising 20, 30, 40% of the time on some boards, depending on the range advantage and nut advantage. Whereas the in position player very rarely raises all that often when facing a bet. So we have these 4 big factors here: hand type, nut advantage, stack depth, and position. And we can put all of this together into the bet response flow chart. And this is how my brain works. This is how I'm figuring out how I play in most scenarios. So when we are facing a bet, first things first, what type of hand do we have? Do we have nothing? Do we have junk? If you have junk, fold. Life's easy. Do we have a marginal made hand, like top pair bad kicker, middle pair, ace high, etc.? Well, if that's the case, call. Easy. Gets a little bit tricky though when we have a premium made hand or a draw. In that case, we want to ask, do we have the nut advantage? As we have more and more really good hands in our range that our opponent either cannot have or they have relatively few of in their range, if we have the nut advantage, we should be more inclined to raise. And our sizing is usually 2.5x or so in position, 3x or bigger from out of position. If we do not have the nut advantage though, we opt to just check call with pretty much our entire range. If this flowchart has been helpful for you, I have built tons of them for all different spots, like when you should be bluffing or when you should continuation bet, when you should bluff catch, and much, much more. And you can download all of them for free right now at pokercoaching.com/flowcharts. Okay? Another point is that the deeper the stack to pot ratio, SPR, gets, meaning the deeper stacked we are, the more premium of a hand that we need to have to actually raise, because when we're playing, let's say, 25 big blinds deep, if you get a hand like top pair, top kicker, you're usually fine just getting all of your money in on the flop, and if you go broke, you go broke. But if you're playing 300 big blinds deep, if you're getting it in with top pair, top kicker, and your opponent wants to put in 300 big blinds, you're probably going to be in very, very bad shape. So that's it. That is the bet response flowchart. Whenever you're facing a bet, go through this process every single time, and you will usually find the best play. And if you find the best play more often than your opponents, you're going to make more money from poker than they do. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, do me a quick favor. Click the like button, click the subscribe button, and also in the comment section, let me know if you were doing anything incorrectly. What a lot of people do incorrectly is they don't fold all their junk. They splash around way too much. Also, a lot of players raise some of their marginal made hands every time. Remember how I said hands like top pair bad kicker opt to check call the majority of the time or call a bet the majority of the time? A lot of people raise every top pair, and that results in their raising range not being polarized. It becomes what's referred to as linear, where it's just like your best hands. But think about what that does to your calling range. If your calling range contains no reasonable hands, well, now your range is all pretty bad hands. And if your range is pretty bad hands, all your opponents have to do to crush you is just bet the flop and bet the turn and bet the river, and then you cannot win. Something else a lot of people do wrong is that they always raise their draws, or they only raise with their really good draws, or they don't raise anything. You are supposed to raise a decent chunk of the time. Some people only raise with the nuts. It's also a big problem because, again, what does that do to the rest of your range? It makes your calling range very weak, and it makes your raising range really strong. And if your opponents know every time you raise you have the nuts, their life is easy. They can just get out of the way. And as you play against better and better opponents, you have to make sure you are playing a better and better strategy. And following this flowchart will ensure you are doing that. So anyway, let me know the mistakes you made, and hopefully this video helped you clear up a leak or two. Good luck in your games. Have fun. Click the like and subscribe button and the notification bell. I appreciate you. Good luck, and I will talk to you next time.